In Westfield Heights, the streets always looked like they belonged on a postcard. Freshly mowed lawns stretched neatly from one house to the next. Neighbors waved politely as they carried groceries, and children drew chalk pictures on driveways without a worry in the world. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names and trusted the rhythm of everyday life. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect neighborhood, something darker was beginning to take root. For a group of restless teenagers, the calm predictability of the town was suffocating. To them, the cheerful smiles and quiet routines felt fake, like a stage where everyone played the same role over and over again. They wanted something that would break the monotony, something that would make them feel alive. The group wasn't large, only 4 of them, but together they became inseparable. They weren't the kind of kids teachers worried about, at least not on the surface. They showed up to class, handed in assignments, and blended into the background. But in private, when adults weren't looking, their thoughts began to twist. They weren't entertained by sports games or parties like their peers. Instead, they gravitated toward horror stories, crime reports, and dark videos circulating online. What others found disturbing, they treated as fuel for their curiosity. Soon, laughter became their way of coping with the violence they consumed. A shocking headline wasn't tragic to them. It was funny. A story about a stranger's suffering was not a warning, but a joke. The more they indulged these thoughts, the more powerful they felt. To joke about cruelty was one thing, but to imagine it happening close to home was even more thrilling. They began whispering about what it might feel like to step into the role of the monsters they read about. At first, the whispers were just for shock value, testing the boundaries of each other's comfort. But quickly, it became clear that none of them were afraid. Each dark thought was met with laughter, each disturbing idea with agreement. They weren't repelled by evil. They welcomed it as though it were a game no one else was brave enough to play. Outside of their group, no one suspected a thing. Parents believed they were harmless kids with too much free time. Neighbors saw them walking the streets and thought nothing more than that they were just another cluster of teens hanging out. Even their teachers overlooked the restless glances and the scribbled notes they passed in class. Westfield Heights was a place that trusted its youth, a place where crime was a stranger and danger belonged only on television. That trust became the shield these teenagers hid behind. The safety of the town gave them confidence because what better place to act out dark fantasies than in a community that never expected it? They were bored of the same bike rides, the same family barbecues, the same smiling faces at the grocery store. They wanted chaos, something that would shake the world awake, if only for their own amusement. The perfect suburb was about to become the stage for something no one could have predicted, and its carefully built image of safety would crumble under the weight of their laughter. The basement where the teenagers gathered was nothing remarkable at first glance. It was a cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes of holiday decorations, and the faint smell of dust. But to them, it was more than just a room. It was their hideout, a place where they could strip away the masks they wore for parents, teachers, and neighbors. The dim light, the low ceiling, and the secrecy gave them a sense of belonging that no one else could understand. In that basement, they weren't bored kids from a quiet town. They were creators of their own twisted world, and in that world, rules no longer applied. It was in this space that the idea of a pact first took shape. The teens wanted more than late-night jokes about crime and horror. They wanted something permanent, something that would bind them together beyond ordinary friendship. They began to talk about loyalty, about proving themselves in a way that no one could question. Each time they returned to the basement, the conversations grew bolder, and the lines they once pretended to tiptoe around faded. Murder stopped being a shocking word whispered for effect. It became a possibility they all entertained seriously. To them, the thought of killing wasn't frightening. It was exhilarating. They imagined the panic it would unleash, the way it would dominate the town's conversations, and the headlines it would create. They convinced themselves they were smarter than everyone else, that no one would ever suspect a group of kids who blended in so well. What fueled their excitement most was not the act itself, but the idea that they could get away with it. That thought filled them with a dangerous kind of confidence. The pact they formed was simple but absolute. Loyalty above everything. Once you agreed, there was no turning back. They swore never to betray one another, no matter what. It wasn't written down on paper, but it was etched deeply into their minds. The group transformed their friendship into something darker, like soldiers preparing for a battle only they knew was coming. They started assigning roles, discussing how each person's skills could contribute. One was good at planning, another at sneaking around unnoticed, another at finding ways to cover tracks. Each contribution made the idea feel less like a fantasy and more like a real plan. What made it even more chilling was the way they treated it all as entertainment. They laughed at their own ideas, mocking the very concept of morality. They weren't thinking about consequences or guilt. They were thinking about the thrill of watching everyone else scramble in fear. Their humor became their armor, a way to shield themselves from the gravity of what they were about to commit. Each laugh pushed them further away from normality and deeper into the belief that they were untouchable. In that basement, the pact sealed their fate. The decision wasn't made in a moment of anger or desperation. It was made in a haze of amusement and boredom. They chose to step into the darkest role possible simply because it gave them a sense of power they had never felt before. And while the rest of Westfield Heights continued its peaceful routine, unaware of the storm building in the shadows, the group's loyalty to one another and to their deadly plan grew stronger with every secret meeting. Emily Carter lived only a few blocks away from the teenagers who had chosen her fate, though she never knew they existed. She was the kind of person whose presence brightened any room, even without trying. At 20 years old, Emily balanced her college classes with a part-time job at a local cafe. Customers remembered her for her warm smile and the way she always remembered their orders. Friends described her as dependable, someone who was always on time, always ready to listen, and never without a kind word. In a town like Westfield Heights, where predictability was the norm, Emily embodied everything good and safe. To the teens watching her, she represented a life they despised, ordinary, hopeful, and full of promise. The decision to target Emily was not random in their minds, though they liked to tell themselves it was. They justified it by saying she was just another face, just another routine to break. What made her stand out to them wasn't anything she did wrong, but how predictable her days were. She walked the same route home after her evening shifts, always with headphones in, always trusting the quiet streets of the suburb she had grown up in. To the group, that predictability was an invitation, a weakness they could exploit. The more they studied her, the easier it became to imagine how her life could end at their hands. Watching her became their new obsession. They followed from a distance, noting the nights she stayed later at work, the friends she met for coffee, the time she left her porch light on. They collected these details like hunters learning the habits of their prey. Each piece of information gave them confidence, turning their once vague plan into something concrete. In their minds, Emily stopped being a person. She became a project, a test, a symbol of their ability to take control. They never spoke of her kindness or her future. They only spoke of her as an opportunity, a role in the story they wanted to write for themselves. The planning took weeks, and with each passing day, their excitement grew. They joked about how the town would react when she disappeared, imagining neighbors crying on camera or reporters filling the quiet streets. They mocked the idea of candlelight vigils, laughing at the thought of people gathering to mourn someone they had already stripped of humanity. Every cruel fantasy made them feel more powerful, more certain that what they were about to do was not only possible but inevitable. Emily, meanwhile, lived her life unaware of the dangers circling her. She worried about exams, shifts at the cafe, and paying her bills. She texted her friends about weekend plans, posted photos of sunsets on social media, and trusted that her neighborhood was as safe as it had always been. She had no reason to believe that anyone was watching, no reason to think her routine was being studied with such cold precision. That trust in her surroundings was exactly what the teens counted on. The contrast between Emily's innocence and the group's intentions grew sharper with each passing day. While she smiled at strangers and planned for the future, they sharpened their ideas into a single plan designed to erase her from the world. For them, she was not Emily Carter, the young woman with dreams and a community that cared for her. She was the chosen target. The first step in proving their pact was real, and in their minds that choice was not a tragedy. It was entertainment. The night they had been waiting for arrived on a warm summer evening, the kind that carried the sound of crickets through the air and made the town feel even quieter than usual. To most people in Westfield Heights, it was just another peaceful night, but for the group of teenagers, it was the culmination of every dark thought they had nurtured in secret. They gathered in their basement one last time before stepping into the world with their plans set in motion. Masks were pulled from backpacks, gloves were tucked into pockets, and the kind of nervous energy that might have stopped ordinary kids only fueled them further. Emily finished her shift at the cafe later than usual. The warm glow of the streetlights guided her walk home, the same path she had taken countless times without a second thought. Headphones in her ears, she scrolled through her phone between glances at the empty sidewalks. She didn't notice the shadows that moved just beyond the reach of the lights, nor the quiet footsteps that trailed her at a distance. Every detail of her routine had been studied, every moment anticipated, and the group knew this was the perfect night. Emily was pulled into the darkness of a narrow side street, her belongings scattering onto the ground. The teens had rehearsed this moment in their minds so many times that the attack unfolded with disturbing ease. But what they hadn't rehearsed was the cruelty that followed. Instead of carrying out the act quickly and leaving, they lingered. They mocked her, turning her terror into their form of entertainment. For them, it wasn't enough to silence her. They wanted to revel in the control, to stretch the moment into something unforgettable. The smugness that had carried them through weeks of planning and the night of the crime had collapsed under the weight of evidence. They sat in silence as recordings of their own voices echoed through the trial, every cruel word now a nail in the coffin of their freedom. The jury didn't take long to decide their fate. Life sentences were handed down, and the teens who once thought murder was hilarious were left facing decades behind bars. The story of Emily Carter became more than a local tragedy. It was a chilling reminder of how evil can grow quietly, even among the young, nurtured by boredom, arrogance, and the desire to feel powerful. Westfield Heights eventually moved forward, but scars remained. The laughter of those teenagers had turned into silence, their freedom into confinement, and their so-called joke into a permanent horror. What they once thought of as entertainment ended with the loss of a young woman's life and their own futures destroyed.